They can hear me. Okay. Yeah. Let people come in. Yeah.
Do you want me to disable the windows?
Yeah. Tell me when to start. Here it says I've been signed out. Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, no, it's relatively yeah, I think the coding portion is going well too. So there was one. I fixed it. Yeah, I was like, how did that happen?
This will be like an appendix. Don't log out this one.
Oh, did you, what did you say?
You want to leave this meeting?
What if I make Petros
People can hear us in the Zoom or?
Everyone can hear you.
Okay, we have some small technical issue, it seems, and then we're going to start.
Be able to join. And then from here, we can make whatever, you're gonna have to sign out of your.
I can.
Oh, yeah?
Give you all the meeting idea.
So you have to stay on.
David,
You got some research you're doing we don't know about?
ants and angels.
And what?
Ants and angels. Max, you remember David Sondergaard?
Yeah.
They just have a baby this morning.
Congratulations, but he's such a nerd, he doesn't even send me a picture. Like, dude, first thing you do is send the picture.
Start? Says it's or
He only has one dog.
Okay.
Strange dog.
Big smile.
Has one strange dog. I love that. Person that is strange.
I can be a host, yeah, whatever you want me to be. Yeah.
I think you are.
Okay, so what should I can I start or I don't need video or anything, I just start.
You're all set.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm one of these people that needs no introduction. So I'm Petros Koumoutsakos, I guess, and I'm not going to talk about AI for a change. I'm going to tell you about angels and insects. And what is this angels and insects? I'm using them as examples. So angels is something that usually human imagination uses to for a creature that is perfect in many respects, for a creature that is beautiful, a creature that has superpowers, can fly in many different places. So human imagination is something that makes angels, and then nature is making insects, and then insects are not so elegant as angels may be, but insects are clumsy, they have big legs, they have some wings that they more or less can fly. So nature tinkers and artificial, what humans do is trying for perfection, and I would like to juxtapose these two different ways of doing optimization. So talking about insects, I'd like to remark that insects were some of the first creatures that actually utilize their wings in order to survive. So having wings help you survive, because as soon as a certain environment would become toxic, then you open up your wings and you fly to a new place. And that's what insects were able to do. So now humans, usually we are not fascinated by insects, but we are fascinated by other bigger animals like birds. And what we do is we always have been fascinated by bird flight, and then what we do is we try to fly like the birds do. And so here is one of the first times that someone was able to fly. This is Otto Lilienthal, arguably one of the first flights. He built his own airplane. I think after this image, he crashed and died, and as he was being carted off, being German, he said, sacrifices are necessary. and indeed, sacrifices are necessary. So today we want to fly, and of course, we want to fly cheaper. So what does it mean we want to fly cheaper? It usually implies drag reduction. So if you look at the example of an airline cost, and these are ballpark figures that may have changed a lot depending on the price of the fuel these days, you look at all the percentages and you see that you have a fuel that is taking about 12% of the cost, and then the profit margin is about 3%. So if you are able to give about a 10% in terms of fuel savings, you have a drag reduction idea that can give a 10% fuel savings, then you increase profits by 40%, and that's quite substantial. And of course, there's other things that we want to do. We want to have adaptive control when we fly. So we want to be safer, and at the same time, something that gets popularity is we would like to respect the environment. We try to have noise control, shorter takeoff and landing, and all sorts of things like that. So now, as the technology is evolving, we're starting to make remarkable devices. And one of these remarkable devices is we can put a gear at the finger of an ant. So we try to rethink flight as the technology is evolving. So what does this mean? People start to come up with beautiful ideas about how micro machines, they can help solve the intractable problem of turbulence. So people have been thinking, how about if I put little devices on the surface of the wing, and then these devices can control the drag of the aircraft. Now, this idea appeared some time ago. It appeared back in 1993. You can see that still such great ideas don't always make it to practice. So we do have amazing technologies. We have amazing technologies to actively control flows. So we have all these different micro machines. But then you can imagine why these micro machines may not be sustainable on the surface of an airplane by looking at what happens to little creatures when rain is hitting them. And of course, you don't want this to happen to all the micro devices of the surface of the machines. So bottom line, we have interesting technologies, and then the technologies that we develop, we try to optimize the utilization of these technologies. So one way to do this is to learn from nature. And like every Greek person knows, and very well from the mythology. So here is done by Greeks and painted beautifully by Italians. There is the myth of Icarus, and we all know that learning from nature, you have to be careful what you are learning and what are the limits of the things that you learn from nature. So what you can do is you can learn from nature from its final product. And in that sense, that is why perhaps the wings of an airplane, they are similar to the ones from a bird. But the other thing that you can do, and I will be arguing today, is that you can learn from the algorithms that nature uses to produce these final products. So what is algorithm number one? Algorithm number one is something that we all know as starting from little babies, and this is the algorithm of imitation. So we imitate, and not only humans imitate, but also animals are great at imitating. You have butterflies, so there is this viceroy butterfly on the left, and then this viceroy butterfly is something that birds like to eat. But then there is the monarch butterfly, and this is a butterfly that birds do not like to eat. So the viceroy tries to imitate the shape and the colors and the wings of the monarch butterfly so it doesn't get eaten. So imitation is something that we have used a lot in our design. So I'll give you a little example. Here is a horseshoe vortex. What is a horseshoe vortex? Imagine that you have the pillars of a bridge. As you look at the pillars of a bridge, you look at the cross section of a pillar, and then you see the water flowing, and then around the end of the bridge, the bottom of the bridge, where the bridge cuts the surface of the water, you see some swirling flow. And this is the so-called thing horseshoe vortex, and it's a horseshoe vortex because this vortex just goes around the pillar. Now, these horseshoe vortices, they're very important for things like submarines because of their tower. So you have all these vortices that are being generated, and that's actually very dangerous for submarines, not only because they affect their capabilities to swim, but they also affect their detection. The vortices, they produce noise, and then this noise can allow submarines to be detected from very, very far away. So people who make submarines, they're thinking about that. So here is the Albuquerque, an old type of submarine from the US Navy. And you can see that you have this vertical section, and then there is a later generation, the Seawolf from the US Navy. And you can see now that you start to get the tapering. And arguably, people say that the Seawolf was trying to imitate Russian submarine, like the Typhoon II, that has this particular curve. And then what the Russian submarine finally was found to imitate was the fin of the sharks and how they come to blend with the surface of the body. So this idea of imitation is actually very old. I showed you the picture of Lilienthal, but there was another person, there was an Austrian pilot, this Igo Etrich, and he was actually designing planes that they look like flying seeds. This is the Zanonian seeds. This is a beautiful seed that actually flies, and that's how they disperse in the different forests. So this imitation has always been an inspiration. Now, of course, with mimicry, you may have some problems. And the problem is that you have to be careful about what is it that you try to imitate. In case you cannot read here, it says, are you sure about this tongue? It seems odd that the pointy head and a long beak is what makes them fly. It's a good guess, right? It's a very prominent feature, so it might as well try that. And then evolution takes over. So now I told you about nature. I told you about the artificial things. Now, what is optimization? So optimization means many different things to many different people. So the definition I like is perhaps the simplest and the coarsest. And it's the action of making the best or most effective use of a situation or a resource. What it means is that you don't necessarily try to change the situation or the resource, but you try to make the best or the most effective use of what you have. Now, there is also the mathematical description of that you have some parameters. and then you try to change the parameters with regard to some criteria so that you get the best of a set of available alternatives. And then what a lot of us learn in school is we usually learn about a function that has a gradient, and then we use all these mathematical algorithms to compute the values of the gradients and to use the gradients to do the minimization. Now, this is also where sciences like mathematics and computer science may differ, because you have other places where this concept of gradients doesn't appear, as for example, when you're trying to do software optimization or program optimization, where you don't have gradients or cost functions that you can differentiate. And there you have to use different techniques to do optimization. So now going back to this mimicry, so we said that nature supposedly has optimal structures that we can mimic the products of nature. Maybe we can also mimic the algorithms of nature. So here is a picture of ants. I took this picture because it was in a windy day, and I was fascinated how the ant would not let go of the cargo. So the thing was upside down, was being flown away, it would not let go of the cargo. But besides holding on to the cargo, they have also some other amazing things that they do, is that they are operating in clusters, and then people try to learn from the way ants are solving problems. So there is this algorithm of ant colony optimization. And what is the ant colony optimization? What they do is they communicate through a beautiful concept, which is called stigmergy, from stigma and ergo, which means that you do something and you don't tell the other person what to do, but the other person sees what you've done and follows up. So this is the stigmergy, and that's the main way that ants communicate, and they do that by laying down pheromone, which is a chemical that they emit. So what they do is they forage, they go out, they search for food in parallel exploration of the environment, and then they use this stigmergy to find and solve problems. So the problem they will be solving is what's the shortest distance between 2 points. And the 2 points here is going to be the place in the mound where the ants are coming out, and the other point is the apple, this apple that they want to feed on. And of course, we all know from our geometry that the best distance here is the straight line, but then how do ants discover this distance? So what they do is they explore, and then what they do is as they explore, they emit a chemical substance, which is this pheromone. And then the other ants, they're smelling the pheromone, and then they tend to choose the path with a strong pheromone concentration. So obviously, the shortest the distance, the less they're going to be the evaporation. So there is a reinforcement that happens on the path, and then you can find this food source. Now, the things that they can do also, they can also solve more difficult problems. If all of a sudden there is an obstacle, no big deal for the ants. They continue doing their algorithm, and they're able to go around and to find, again, the food. So here are some experiments that people have done. I was actually not able to track back the source of where I found these videos. So what you have is you have a bridge here, and there is a shorter part in the bridge, and then there is a bigger part in the bridge, and then there is some food here. And then what you do is you let ants travel, and then you try to see what kind of a situation will happen. And then you have also a little example that you can do here in the computer. You have some virtual ants that are coming out from the right. There is food on the left. They're doing this thing with their pheromone. And then what I want you to observe is that by employing this ant-based algorithm, what they're able to discover, they're able to solve the problem of which one of the two branches is shorter by this concept of stigmergy. I'll play this one forward, and then you see that slowly the other branch is being abandoned, and then this branch is being favored, and the same thing is going to happen to the picture on the left. Where do people use that? They use it to solve some tough problems, like the traveling salesman problem, where you have to go through every city once and only once, and then you have to minimize the total distance. This is a tough problem. It's an NP-complete problem, and then the classical combinatorial optimization algorithms may have a hard time, but you can see that the ant algorithm that I just described, by traveling along the different paths, eventually through this concept of the pheromone, it's a very robust concept, it can apply between the mound and the apple, and it can apply also to concepts like this. So in our lab, we also have done some algorithms by imitating some creatures. We have actually come up with an algorithm to imitate bacteria chemotaxis. And bacteria, what they do, bacteria travel along a chemical gradient. And at some point, when they are not happy about the gradient that they see, then they open their flagella and then they tumble. So how can you do this into an optimization algorithm? Well, you have 3 parameters, which is the velocity of the bacterium. You have a time between the times that they are changing turns or they decide to tumble. And then you have the angle in which they're changing. And then what you're looking for is you're looking to find out what are good probability distributions in order to traverse different gradients. So what you can do is you can learn these different functions, the different probability distributions for different cost functions. And after you have learned them, you can have bacteria that are good for convex functions. You can have bacteria that are good for multimodal functions. And then, of course, you have to have a guess as to what is the function that you're trying to optimize, because you don't want to release the wrong bacteria onto the wrong landscape. Does this work? It works wonderfully. So this is this optimal bacteria that they're learning. Actually, the top one has learned to go away from local minima. The one in the bottom has learned how to go and to do convex functions. So you almost see that it does the gradient descent. But of course, if you take this bacteria here and you put them upstairs, you're not going to get good results. But we found this to be a very robust way. And actually, the 2 students who did this project actually have a very successful company that uses this algorithm. So we have done it also. This is inverse design for an airfoil. What is inverse design for an airfoil? You have a pressure distribution, which is the black line. And then you start with a certain shape. So you start with an arbitrary shape, you run your code, that's the pressure distribution. And the idea is, can I change my shape so that the pressure distribution that I get is the correct? And if I'm able to find that, this is indeed the case. Now, among all the different algorithms that I have seen or we have played with, the one that has been the most powerful has been the evolutionary algorithm. And this is the statement of Darwin from The Origin of Species. And actually, it's important to see that Darwin never used the word evolution in the whole book of The Origin of Species. He has been extremely careful to avoid it, but what he says, I have a slight variation, and if this variation is useful, it is preserved, and then he calls that natural selection. So what's the idea that we do here? The idea is that we are interested in stochastic optimization for fluid mechanics or for other problems. And the idea is that you have access to an input, which is x, and you have only an output f of x. So these black boxes mean that you basically do not know what happens inside there. In a sense, it's like you don't know physics. You don't know physics, but you still want to have an algorithm that optimizes the physics by only extracting the data that you get every time you're trying a new scenario. So this is very useful in the case that you don't have gradients, if you have commercial solvers, and also if you do experiments where gradients are usually very noisy. So this story of the black box, I would like to defend it for a second to show you again how some animals are solving some very beautiful fluid mechanics problems, and I think they don't know fluid mechanics. So there is this insect here that you see is buried. I'll show you a sketch afterwards. This insect is buried inside the sand, and it has some little legs, and the legs are protruding outside. And what it does is basically, by having the legs protruding, is generating a horseshoe vortex. And what this horseshoe vortex does for it is it generates, it digs into the sun, and that's actually how this insect is able to eat. So there is no fluid mechanics, I think, that this guy knows, but it has evolved and it knows how to do that. And there is actually different variations clever variations of this way that you get the fluids to dig for you and to generate to get food. Now, the idea of the evolution strategies that I'm going to tell you about came up in 1964 by a guy called Ingo Reichenberg. He was trying to figure out if a corrugated plate, if by changing the angles of this corrugated plate, he would be able to arrive to zero angle, which arguably would have been the best drug situation. Now, as it turns out, at that time, he tried gradient methods, etc., but then nothing worked. So he started to say, what if I have random variations? So now, how do you make random number generators? 1964, he used a device which is called the Galdon bread, and the Galdon bread is a device that has some sticks that are coming out. Then for each one of the angles, he drops the ball, and then depending on which container the ball arrives, he changes the angle. Now, this is not random search only, because as he progresses, he changes the magnitude of the angles. When he's successful, he's becoming more adventurous, and then the angles go from -20 to 20, if you like. And then when he was becoming less successful, he would decrease this. So this was actually the first example. It was done in experimental laboratory, and as it turns out, he came up with a shape which is not the flat plate. So there is a shape that has less drag than the flat plate. A student of Ingo Reichenberg that I had the honor to supervise was Nico Hansen. Nico came to our lab after finishing his PhD with Ingo in Berlin, and he introduced us to the covariance matrix adaptation technique, which is the extension of that method. The idea of the covariance matrix adaptation technique is that you are sampling points from a probability distribution, and then you don't know what is the mean and the variance, the covariance of this probability distribution, but you are learning it as you are moving ahead and you are collecting data. So it's an adaptive method. So what does it do? You start and you have some kind of a guess for the mean and the covariance, and these are the initial points that you have. The red star is the mean. Then you discard the samples that they have low fitness. Then you sort and you weigh according to the fitness, and then you recombine the points and you get a new mean for the Gaussian probability distribution. So at the same time, you have to adapt the covariance matrix. So the way you adapt the covariance matrix, you start with something which is circular or whatever dimensions you have sphere. And then you have two things that you do. The rank 1 update basically tries to find the path between the means that you are collecting. And that's actually the method with which Nico came to our lab. And then what I thought is that, well, there is some information that you guys are throwing away, and the information they have been throwing away is before doing the recombination, there is all these other elements that exist there. So you can actually create a covariance between before you do the recombination, and that's actually the mu update, which is actually more parallel, and it's actually a very popular technique. This rank mu update is something that a lot of people are using today. So this is this covariance matrix adaptation technique, and again, this is the paper. There is also software and so on, and the key way, how do you approach optimization? You approach it as basically trying to identify and to sample probability distributions. So you do basically two things. You have a model from which you use in order to search for the parameters. The parameters are the x that you're trying to look for, and theta are the mean and the covariance. You try to find the theta by using the data. And then, because these methods are expensive, also we have been using a lot of surrogates in order to accelerate the optimization process. So there is a lot of very interesting crosstalk between surrogates and these probability distributions. You don't need to worry only about Gaussian probability distributions. If you have an idea that your problem is multimodal, then you can come up with multiple Gaussians, and of course the optimization problem changes, but we can talk about that. So there was a project when I was at ETH that there was the undergrads, and then they were coming up with a robotic device. We're talking about 20 years ago. They were thinking about making a stool that can walk on its own. They built actually the stool, but then they had also a model for the stool which amount 250 ODEs and about 120 parameters. So we used actually CMAES, and we compared with all the other methods that existed. And here, what you see here, you see a race between algorithms. The different algorithms are racing, and you see random search doesn't go anywhere. This is a popular search method in MATLAB. This was one of our competitors, and this is CMAES, and the tool was going very far. So we have also software, and people, I know there are people in this class who took my course AM 211 that they learned about this software, where we actually teach people how to use this covariance matrix adaptation technique and deploy it on massively parallel computing architectures. And the idea is that you don't have to worry about all the details of the optimization, but of the parallelization. All you have to worry is about the methods that you use in order to do your optimization. You have to worry about your problem, not about the software. And I know that Fabian actually gave one of the courses in the CompuFest that IACS is organizing here in last February or January? January. Okay. So there's a lot of great features in the software, and that's actually that I hope to people to teach next year in AM 207. Now, a few more things about this. I'd like to show you some highlights of what we have been able to accomplish by doing this technique. If you have good eyes, here you will see there is a battle for survival that is going on. So this big fish is actually going crazy as trying to eat a small fish. And then here it is actually the situation that is happening. So there is this big fish, and it's trying to catch this larva. And what is interesting to see is that how this larva is able to escape by doing a very interesting thing at the beginning. Watch what it does in the beginning. It curves the body into a C shape, and then it escapes. So this is a very famous pattern, an escape pattern for animals, small animals in particular. So here is the zebrafish that is been escaping. So the question that we asked, is this thing optimal? Is nature optimal? Can we do better than that? So you can do experiments and analyze and study, but you don't understand why things are happening the way they are happening. So what we do is we run full 3D simulations, and then what came out at the end of the optimization is actually the C-start. And there are a few things in this slide. It's a loaded slide. So first of all, I want to show you that this is how many full-blown 3D simulations we had to do. So you had to do 800 simulations, and each one of these simulations at a time could be taken about a week in a supercomputer that we were using. So these were expensive. But in the end, what came out, if you look at, we did it in 2D and we did it in 3D. And actually, you look at the center line of the fish. This is the experiment. This is what comes out from the optimization, and this is if you have the propulsive stroke. So what this little guy does is the following. The red lines that you see, it's basically lines that they tell you elements of the fluid across these lines, they never mix. So, and then the particles are particles in the fluid. So you will see the blue ones are disordered and the green ones are ordered in the beginning. So what this guy does is it moves, and then it traps some fluid inside, and then it moves its tail and generates a vortex, and the vortex takes this fluid away. And so what we did is we looked at this ball of fluid, this blue thing back there. That's where we put all these particles, these blue ones. And then we are able to play it back in the computer and see where all these blue particles came from. And then we went and we filled the gap with all the green particles. So again, what we learned from that is basically the mechanism. And the mechanism is you trap with your body some fluid, and then by a swing of your tail, you use fluid mechanics to take this mass of fluid and throw it away, and then you escape. Now, we did these things not only in the computer, but we did it also in real devices. So we had a project where we did actual turbines, and in these turbines, the main project was how do you do the fuel injectors? What should be the fuel injectors that you have here so that you have a stable combustion flame and low emissions? These are two different objectives. So it's a multi-objective optimization problem. And then what we did is we actually went to the lab and we attached to the device a computer, and then we were getting measurements, getting data from the test rig, and then the computer was actually automating the process by which it was creating a Pareto front of minimizing NOx emissions and the pulsation. And we ended up getting pictures that they look like that. Of this is a Pareto front, and then these are the different boxes that you see. Every cross corresponds to a different set of flow rates. So you have these 8 valves, and then if you find yourself down here where you have high pulsation but you have low NOx, that means that your flow is quite uniform. And then when you find yourself up here where you have low vibrations but you pollute a lot, then this accounts for you have to have a regular schedule. So the algorithm actually produced 2 or 3 patents, and this thing is actually working in real turbines. So I'm actually quite happy to see this algorithm making it into real projects. So there's tons of projects we have done, from Formula 1 cars to microfluidic devices, jets, and so on and so forth. And I'm actually very happy that when I came here one day, I was talking to Katya, and she was telling me that she has this great optimization software that she's using. I said I would like to compare with it, and then as it turns out, she had been using CMAES. So I was very happy to see Katya using that, and I think there are several people who are using it and generate patents with it. So people are using it in different places, and not only again in the computer, but also in real engines. So so that's the algorithm that I mentioned, and that is the case of evolution. So there is another algorithm that you can use, and that is learning to solve problems. So that's another algorithm, and so I'm going to go back and use again my little bugs. So so here is an excerpt. This is a 3.5-minute movie that I have cut down to 30 seconds. This is this little bug, and he has a problem. He's going home with his dirt ball and it's stuck. So you can see that he's trying very hard to get it out of there. And then you can see by putting a lot of effort, he has some success. But then it's not going to make it. So then thinks about making an alternative. So he says, let me do it differently. So he goes from the other side, but then you will see that totally misses the point. And long story short, after watching this thing for 3.5 minutes, and it's a great movie, I recommend to the cinephiles of the audience to watch it. It's successful. You want to applaud the bug at the end. So what is survival? Is survival the capability of solving problems? And I will argue actually that survival is indeed what you are born with, but also what you're learning to do to solve problems that you are experiencing. So there is a particular formulation that I like about this approach, and that is the approach of reinforcement learning that a lot of people and a lot of our colleagues in computer science are pursuing. So what is reinforcement learning? Reinforcement learning is behavioral changes due to experiences. And what you have is you have an action, you have a stimulus, and you have a reward. And then what happens is this stimulation pattern is rewarded to a certain behavior. Now, I don't know how many of you know Skinner. Skinner was one of the first famous psychologists, experimental psychologists, who was at Harvard. And he was trained in pigeons. And then he was trained in pigeons. Here he has trained the pigeons to play ping pong. It's a pity you don't hear his voice. So the pigeons, they throw the ball to each other, and now you will see this pigeon will succeed that the ball goes the other way. So there will be a door that opens and the pigeon gets some food. and now the other pigeon will score a point and gets some food, and that was a way that Skinner was training pigeons. I don't know if you know why he was training pigeons, but it's a pretty gruesome story. Basically, he was interested in putting pigeons inside missiles. At that time, it was not very easy to have guided missiles, and the idea was that you train the pigeons to peck on something when they see a certain image, and the idea is you will put them inside a missile, and as soon as from the window of this missile, the pigeons, they will see a particular place that you want to bomb, they will peck, and then the bomb will be activated. So there is a story about that, about pigeon pilots that you can find in the MIT Technology Review. And there's also the Skinner Foundation archives at Harvard that is really a beautiful, an interesting story. Let's put it like this. Now, more recent years, there's a lot more peaceful things that are going on. So people use reinforcement learning to play games. And now here, what is it that you are observing? You're observing the whole state of the system, which is every pixel. And then you learn how to play this game. So this is the game that maybe some of us remember in playing. People have also used reinforcement learning to play the game of Go. And also, there's a lot of tests that people do in this domain where they have these mechanical systems, and then they let they train the parameters of the system. It's like the stool I was telling you, except that now they're like looking like bugs and robots and all these kind of things. So what is reinforcement learning? The idea of reinforcement learning is that you are observing the environment. You have to be careful what that you're observing. And then you are giving this information to a neural network in this case. It can be any other interpolation. And then you're producing, in this case, a mean and a variance of a Gaussian probability distribution. So you sample then this probability distribution and you take an action that you're affecting the environment. And then the environment changes and you receive a reward. So you can imagine that you observe the state of the backgammon, and then you decide that you take an action, that you make this particular move, and then you get a reward. In the case of the backgammon, the reward comes at the end, but then you have to find ways to backpropagate the reward. There's lots of beautiful algorithms. The interesting thing is that you play a lot of games, and then one of the key questions is when you play all these different games, all these samples that you generate by playing the game many, many times, what do you do with them? Do you discard them? So these are, in the computer science jargon, these are called experiences. And now the idea is, how can I use past experiences for what is the task that I have in hand at the moment? So what you do is you basically have to maximize a cost function, the expectation of a cost function, and the expectations in terms of the policy, which is the probability distribution. But instead of sampling the current policy that you have, you do basically what physicists know very well as importance sampling, where you are sampling from the experiences. Actually, when I looked at the experience replay, I said, hold on a second, this is basically importance sampling. So now experience replay is very interesting, but actually very often the experiences that you have may have nothing to do with the problem in hand that you're facing at the moment. So, and in particular, in fluid mechanics problems, you have a lot of situations that you find yourself training in very different places than very different situations than what you experience later. So the idea is, how do you use memory? So which memories to use and which memories to forget? So Guido Novati came up with a very simple idea. He basically used what people do in physics, that when you try to do importance samplings, you better have these two probability distributions to be related in each other. So when you create the ratio, first of all, the ratio has to be bounded. And the second one is you look to satisfy some kind of a Kullback-Leibler divergence between the probability distribution that you have and the probability distribution you are sampling from in the past. So this is this remember and forget experience replay. So you learn basically what to get from the memory and what not to use from the memory. This is Guido, who's now working at DeepMind, and that is his algorithm of remember and forget, experience, replay. And if you want to be philosophical, you can find the roots of this algorithm in Marcel Proust, but I'm not going to push it. So I want to show you results. Results are, so it seems, and I keep giving this talk in many places, and I'm waiting to have someone from DeepMind come in and shoot me, but they have not shot me yet. So it outperforms everything that everybody ever has done. And if you get threatening messages in IACS website, you can refer the people to me. But basically, if you go and you use it in all these different Androids, this is the reward that you get. And then what you find actually is that there is a metric here that shows the difference in the importance sampling between the two probability distributions. And the refer actually by construction makes these Kullback-Leibler divergences to go down. And that's actually our explanation why we are doing well. And then when people are doing all these other algorithms they do, you monitor and you see this Kullback-Leibler divergence that they have is not good. So that means their experiences are not representative of what's happening now. One more thing is if you take this off-the-shelf deep reinforcement learning algorithms and apply them in fluid mechanics problems, they don't work. And maybe that's why actually deep reinforcement learning has not made so big inroads in fluid mechanics as things in neural nets that you just get TensorFlow and it runs. Reinforcement learning is a little bit more tricky and requires effort. Here you have an ellipse that tries to swim behind a cylinder, and if you use any other reinforcement learning, it doesn't work. This is just to show you the difference between the group of Michael Jordan and Peter Abil and Berkeley. This is their Android. This is our Android, and you can see actually our Android finds an interesting way to walk. And the interesting way to walk is you basically kick yourself and you fly up. But of course, this is because of the mechanics that are involved in these problems. In a little bit more serious problems, we have used this algorithm to do reinforcement learning to do fish schooling. So what we have done is if you have two fish and the fish are moving, what you find is that the vortices that you see here, this is the colors. If one fish tries to follow another, then it's going to be disturbed by this. And then it's not so easy. Somehow you have to put some energy in order to be able to follow. So we apply this idea of deep reinforcement learning to the case of swimmers. We had to be careful about the states, the actions and the rewards, but then we did two games. The first game was we had the swimmer in front and it swims, and then we asked the second swimmer to stay level with the first swimmer. And then when it stays level, it's able to achieve that. But then we were surprised because we look at the power of deformation of this swimmer, of the follower, and we found that it uses less energy than the one in front. And basically what we found is that it's using actually about 12% less energy by swimming right behind the other swimmer. Now we said, okay, how about if we maximize efficiency? And now actually it became even more interesting because it doesn't stay right behind the other swimmer, but it wiggles between the vortices and it learns to manipulate the vortice, and it finds a beautiful swimming strategy that gives it a 20% in terms of gain of average efficiency. We've done this also in 3D. 3D is different than 2D. This thing has to learn to be offset in 3D because the vortices in 3D are offset. So this is something that we did, and you can imagine that you have some swimmers, you have situations like that where these two swimmers, they get a vortex from each cycle. You have one swimmer that gets each one of the vortices from two others. So we've done reinforcement learning for control, and now I would like to show you something that we have done recently and I'm quite excited about. And the idea now is to use reinforcement learning to solve equations. So how do you go about solving equations? Actually, first I'll show you how to do closures for equations. What does this mean? So let's say you have the equation f of u is equal to 0, and you have a particular grid that you can afford to solve this equation. Now, let's say the solution that you get is going to be u bar, but then because you don't have enough money, you cannot get the full solution. So there is something that you miss, which is the u prime. So now what you do is you can write an equation like that, which is f of u bar is equal to some kind of a term that involves the u and the u prime. And a lot of fluid mechanics, at least closure modeling, turbulence modeling, amounts to doing LES and runs and so on, where you try to approximate this R with another function that depends only on the things that you resolve. So and in this case, what is the function that we propose? What we propose is that you learn these closure models through deep reinforcement learning. So how does this work? Now, this is a grid on which you're solving an equation, and you can write down any finite difference scheme that you want. But now, in addition to having grid points, you can consider the grid points as discretization elements, but also you can consider the grid points or a subset of the grid points as agents. And now these agents are learning. So the difference of having one policy is that if you were to do this with one agent, you will have very big states. Even if you do a grid of 32 cube, that takes you to about 10,000 points, and that's a very big state. But now the alternative is that you use agents everywhere, and then they use only local information, and they try to correct. Now, how do they learn where to learn? You don't need to have all the detailed information. You can have actually statistics about the flow. So you can learn by experiments, or you can learn by having direct numerical simulations. I'm sorry, I think I messed up the slide. So yeah, so maybe I did not. So here is a, here we go. How can I play? Here. So here is the cross sections of a homogeneous turbulent flow. And the idea is that you have to go in there and to find closure models. So what we do is we put the agents in an LES field, and then we have states that are local, and we have states that are local. So we have these states here that they depend on the traces of invariance. If you have homogeneous isotropic turbulence, you have to have certain invariances. So we say the states are manifestations of these invariances. And then we take also the energy spectrum that we may have from the LES, this reduced order model, and from the full distribution. And what we do is we try to minimize as a reward the distance between the two. And the action that we have is how do we change the local velocity field in the neighborhood of the agents. So you don't necessarily need the full flow field. You need this 15 plus 6, 21, 26 points. And then someone has to give you this energy spectrum. So for homogeneous turbulence, you can do a lot of simulations. So for example, you can do direct numerical simulations that give you what is the answer. So the answer is the black line that you see here. And now what we have done is we can see that we can use a training set that is for certain Reynolds numbers. And then what we find is that we are able actually to extrapolate to larger Reynolds numbers. Reynolds lambda actually is the Kolmogorov length scale, the lambda. So if you translate it to real numbers, these are tens of thousands. So to the best of my knowledge, this is actually the biggest generalization that we have seen of machine learning to very high Reynolds numbers. Another thing which is interesting is that you train it, perhaps you can train it only in one Reynolds number, this yellow thing here, and then you see how does it behave in other situations. So it's not so bad, but still. It definitely outperforms all these dynamic Smagorinsky models that people had used before. And one last example of what we did with Jane Bae. Jane was a postdoc here at IACS for 3 months. What we did is we trained multi-agent reinforcement learning in a channel flow between two walls. And then we wanted to see if we can predict turbulent flow, which is flow over a plate. So the two things are different in terms of the structures and the things that you to produce. And then what we found is that we were able to train up to this Reynolds number. We were able to extrapolate to higher Reynolds numbers. In the case of the channel flow, you know actually what should be the answer, or the mean answer, but you don't know, of course, all the details. And so we are about 5% off going to Reynolds numbers that correspond to airplane wings. And also for a turbulent boundary layer, we were amazed that we're able to recover experimental results almost perfectly without doing any retraining. Some works in progress with all that. We are doing some other things with fish. So since we can compute fish, maybe we can visualize fish, and we don't need experimentalists to tell us what is the vorticity field, because we can take videos of the fish, and then we can take the video and plug it into the computer, and then we know everything about the flow, and then we can understand what fish are doing, and then maybe we can try to actually infer what is the cost function that the fish have when they're doing different motions. This is the area of inverse reinforcement learning. And with a good friend that I made sure that I put his name on this. At some point I realized I had forgot. Flavio Noca from Geneva. Flavio has come up with this beautiful idea of how to test drones. So to test drones, you cannot use these big wind tunnels because you cannot have these fine details of the flow. So what Flavio came up with the idea of, he takes little windmills, and then he has all these windmills operating. And now, if you want to create a particular velocity profile in 3D, you have to teach the windmills to produce this particular profile. So you can, we have a project where we take atmospheric data in certain areas. We know what is the velocity profile in these areas, and we go and we teach these windmills to move in a certain way to reproduce what is out there in the atmosphere, and then they put the drones. So the second thing is, so there is wind coming to this drone from all these devices. You don't hear the noise, but on top of this also is that this guy receives all sorts of different wind flows, and it's able to do all sorts of different maneuvers by using some of the reinforcement learning algorithms that we have been developing. So I just wanted to tell you that these things are not only good for computers, but they're good actually, in my opinion, in real life. Not over yet. Everything I've shown you is super expensive. It's horrible expensive, costs millions of hours. I don't know how many millions we have spent. And also it's possible only now because computers have become what they are now. I started doing machine learning a long time ago, back in 1999. I was trying to publish this paper. Nobody wanted to publish this paper. It's applications from machine learning to flow modeling optimization. So it appeared in the Center for Thunberg Research Briefs, 1999. And then, of course, I wrote another review paper more recently, and everybody talks about that paper, but this is the original thing. But of course, look at the computers. What it would take back then a year to train takes now 3 minutes. So we're talking about different things. But now here comes the bill, and the bill is that if you want to use a supercomputer, do you have lightning for a city of 20,000 people, 20,000 houses, or do you use the energy for one supercomputer? So we are arriving at situations like that. So I don't know how many cities electricity I have used to show you all these results, a lot. So now we have this reliance in computing everywhere. But now I think it's time to start rethinking about what we do. We cannot go on like that. So it's very exciting to see activities here in Harvard in quantum computing. There's also other things that are interesting, approximate computing and neuromorphic. I don't know, I'd like to learn. I think the stochastic algorithms are well suited to quantum computers. I think Bill here is doing a thesis on trying to see if such a thing will be possible. So that's actually what we are hoping to do. Is this possible? I want to thank you, and I'll take questions. Ask questions on the chat. So there is a question by Gabriel Schleder. It says about optimization algorithms, how do CMA and other nature-inspired algorithms compared to Bayesian optimization in general. So we have done a comparative study where actually we look at different features of the objective function, and then it's not that one algorithm defeats all the other algorithms. So if the function is multimodal, CMA is going to fail. If it has very deep multimodalities, it's going to fail. If you have mild multimodality, it's going to be successful. If the function is having 2 or 3 or more big minima, CMA is going to fail. It's going to capture only one of them. So there is a comparative study where we have analyzed the features of the cost function and how the different algorithms, what are the pros and cons. But I'm very encouraged to see CMA used left and right. I think 2 days ago, there was a candidate for a position here in biomechanics and was showing me how they're optimizing an exoskeleton. And then I asked him, what does he use to optimize? Then he said CMA, yes. So I'm very happy to receive information like that. So it's a matter of, again, it's not the solution to everything. It would not be a good algorithm if I would tell you it is. So other questions? There's another one. In atomistic problems, yeah, I don't know. Misha Kazekin says, seems the nature cares a lot about energy for survival. Living creatures seem to be very efficient with energy, especially given that on average, the resources are scarce. Do you think taking this into account when we model reward optimization goal could improve performance? By all means, the closer, the more you get closer to what kind of an energy expenditure animals have, the more things become interesting. In fact, we did a study like this where on the C-start, where we used actually, we tried to constrain the energy that the animal will be using. And then depending on the energy, we found completely different swimming patterns. I think in the case of survival, when you want to escape, you don't care about how much energy you spend for one particular time. But if you want to swim for a long time, yes, the energy becomes an issue. Yes.
What is a Reynolds number? And can you explain the significance of those slides with Reynolds number on the y-axis?
For which one? The homogeneous turbulence?
Yeah.
So RE lambda of 200 would correspond to real Reynolds number. Now, I would say, maybe I'm wrong, but 200,000, something like that. And for let's say, flow over an airplane or something like that. An airplane has Reynolds numbers of millions and above. So RE lambda of 200, I don't remember now what is the exact translation to tell you. I would multiply with 100 to 100,000. So it's with 1,000. So it's about 200,000, I would say.
I think the question is, what is a Reynolds number to begin with?
A Reynolds number is a characteristic thing of a flow. So a Reynolds number, I'm sorry. So a Reynolds number, so if you have a body like that, and the body has a length, and then it has a velocity, and then there is a viscosity, the Reynolds number is this UL over nu. And when you do, for example, why do you care about this number? Because if you have something out in nature that has a Reynolds number that is, let's say, 1,000. Now, if you want to put it in the lab, if you have an airplane that flies at Reynolds number of 1,000, the length is going to be so big that you cannot put it into the wind tunnel. But then in the wind tunnel, you should be able to increase the velocity, and by keeping this number the same, what you observe in the lab, it's hopefully the same thing as you have in the real life. So I'm sorry, I was in my own world of turbulence. That's it. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Simia.
So in reinforcement learning, do you assume that the reward in the end is given, or can you also contemplate the situation where the reward itself can be adjusted to give you some solution.
Yeah, that's actually, yes, you can do that. One direction that we are pursuing now is that, if this helps to answer your question, is that you don't know the reward, but you can observe what people are doing. You can observe what the animals are doing, and then you have to find a cost function that when you minimize, it would give you this behavior. So that's the inverse problem, which is called inverse reinforcement learning, which I think is very exciting because it's a double inverse problem in a sense that you have to do. You have to do a lot of sampling of different configurations until you hit this particular way. So you have to specify a reward, you look at what motion you get, you look at the motion that you have observed, and you see that the two are not correct. So you go back and you have to change the reward, motion changes. So there is an external loop that you have to do. But that's a very interesting way. And I guess your question maybe points to something in between where you have trade-offs between the two. Yeah. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, just like at the end of your talk, you sort of have this idea of new computing methods with the lighting the houses and stuff. And you talk about approximate computing. Do you see sort of nature-inspired algorithms as a solution for approximate computing? Because nature sort of, I mean, evolution isn't optimal. Right?
Yeah, because you see, you operate in a stochastic domain. You operate in more or less, you don't really care about the precise value. You care, it's particular for these algorithms, you care about the ranking in between the different solutions. When you're doing the selection, you don't care about what is the exact value, but you care, I take the 20 best. I don't care what is the exact value of this 20 best. And that's actually, I can show you that this is very robust into noise. You can imagine that you have a cost function and you want noise to it, but if the noise is not too big, the ranking will not change. So these algorithms are very robust to noise. And I think the stochasticity that they have is for sure very well tailored to approximate computing. And I'm trying to understand myself how can I translate these stochastic techniques into quantum computers. I'll be very curious about that. There's a question here. Can you use your methods to control actuators under a flexible skill to minimize drag? Yes, and we have done that. We have done that with a colleague from Japan, Koji Fukagata. If you look for his name in our references, we had flexible surfaces, and then we could change the stiffness of the surface by using these algorithms to minimize drag. That was in there, yeah. There's another question. Since the deformation of body of fish is in 2D, what important information do you think 3D simulation can give us in addition to the information of the 2D simulation? So in the case of the escape, patterns, we found that 2D and 3D are the same. In the case of the reinforcement learning, are completely different. And they're completely different because if you are a two-dimensional fish, all the vortices are right behind you. If you are a three-dimensional fish, because the way you move your tail as a paddle, you eject vortices in every swing of the paddle. In the 2D fish, all the vorticity comes down from the body and it's been moved by a very thin line into the wake. So it stays right behind the body. But in the case of the 3D, it's very different because it gets displaced to the left and to the right. So 2D, 3D, it all depends on what kind of a problem you're looking at. Yeah.
One thing that sort of strikes me about the revolutionary sort of compute platforms angle to all of this is that it seems like perhaps there's no free lunch, and you have to give up something that hopefully maybe you didn't need in order to get the advantage, right? So in your example of stochastic optimization, you give up some accuracy because you never needed it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you're doing a fluid flow simulation, you maybe can't give up that accuracy. And so actually, Vivi and I were chatting about this yesterday about the future may somehow look just extremely heterogeneous, where everything is different for everything you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you see it that way, or maybe not?
I actually I see the DNS as the precision that we do in fluid mechanics more as an intellectual exercise and less as the truth. I have to say, I love it because you have an equation and you're able to solve it.
Yeah.
But think about it. Is there such a thing as an incompressible fluid? And what everything that you do here really translates to everywhere. Also, do you can really control all the geometries? We can do DNS in a channel flow. I mean, if you go to a real airplane, it has.
But are your algorithms robust to those types of changes in your DNS?
Say again, the what?
Are some of the algorithms that you've presented, are they robust to such changes in the simulation?
I think they will be. I mean, DNS is easy for stochastic optimization algorithms because there is no noise in the cost function somehow. It's you run the simulation twice, you get the same answer from DNS. But you do an LES and you run the simulation twice, you don't get the same answer. And that's what it should be. So so it costs you a lot more, the stochasticity. For the if you have models that are not very exact and you want to optimize on a model that's not very exact, it's going to cost you a lot more iterations. So, but now the question becomes, is there such a thing as an exact model? The more I look at what I do, I personally doubt a lot that if I ever did anything that has to do anything with reality. I mean, what's the error bar between reality and what this fish that I have? Right, the skin of the fish. So here I'm using no slip boundary condition for the fish. If you touch real fish, they have mucus. There's anything goes. I mean, it's
bring back in the UQ, and then all of a sudden.
Well, the UQ is it's that this is another thing that we are doing. So that's yeah. Okay. Anything else? No. We close it. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.